Vintage is the Magic the Gathering format with the most legal cards out of any format. Beyond cards that require ante, physical dexterity, or other such universally illegal and sanctioned play cards, every other card ever printed is legal. Even the most powerful cards in the game, such as the Power 9, are legal, albeit restricted to one copy in a deck. Given that cards are basically never banned in the format, it has resulted in a format centered around powerful cards only really legal in this format. The aforementioned Power 9 will not be on this list because most of them are so similar and so talked about that the video would be fairly boring if it took up so many of the slots. So with that out of the way, let's look at some of the best cards in the Vintage format. Our 10th card on this list that's strong in Vintage is White Plume Adventurer. This Orc Cleric costs 2 generic and 1 white mana, as well as having 3 power and toughness. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. The initiative is a designation that one player has at any given time, and any player can take it by dealing combat damage to you. Whenever you take the initiative, and at the beginning of your upkeep, whenever you have initiative, you venture into the Undercity. The Undercity is a dungeon represented by a token with multiple rooms one can go into and trigger the effects of whenever they venture. These effects are usually small on their own, but can add up over the course of the game. This mechanic was designed for the Commander format, where 4 competing players would attack each other and keep passing the initiative around. However, in a format such as Vintage, where you only have one opponent, it is much easier to both deny your opponent the ability to take the initiative, and by extension, much easier to reap its benefits over multiple turns. White Plume Adventurer is the lowest mana value creature that can give you the initiative in the color white. Since it costs specifically 3 mana, if you open both it and Black Lotus or other mana acceleration, you can reap the benefits of the Undercity as early as your first turn. These dungeon rooms in the Undercity will search your library for basic lands, put counters on your creatures, and can even deal 5 damage at a time with the right room. The number of 5 damage was picked with the Commander's starting life total of 40 in mind, and as such in Vintage, entering that room when you enter can essentially deal 1/4 of your opponent's starting life to them for free. The Venture cards have proven so strong in non-free-for-all formats that White Plume Adventurer was banned outright in Legacy. It has proven quite capable in the Vintage format as well, with white-based initiative decks springing up built around it and Seasoned Dungeoneer finding success as one of the newest strategies in the format. Vintage's power level is so high that it's rare for whole new decks to sneak into that format. So for White Plume Adventurer to take a strong spot in the metagame so quickly is enough for it to earn its spot here on this list. And at number 9, we have Strip Mine. This card can be tapped for 1 colorless mana, or you can tap it and sacrifice it to destroy target land. Strip Mine is the first card in a long line of lands that sacrifice themselves to destroy other lands. Beyond being the first, it's also the strongest, since every other iteration has been an attempt at fixing Strip Mine. This is because the original card is able to punish mana bases freely and with little cost. The most common use of targeted land destruction beyond destroying a specific high-value card is to deny someone access to a specific color. If someone only has one source of blue and you destroy that blue mana, you've effectively cut them off of every blue spell they may have in hand. This holds true in Vintage in particular, where most decks run as little lands as possible in many cases. Ghost Quarter and other future variants would give your opponent a basic land in exchange for the land that was destroyed. These versions of the effects can still remove problematic and specific lands, but are less capable of cleanly denying someone access to a specific color. The only land that's remotely close to Strip Mine is Wasteland, which does much the same thing, except it can only target non-basics. While Vintage decks do often run mostly non-basic lands, Strip Mine is still completely lacking in any restrictions on what this card can target. Wasteland is playable enough that it's a Legacy staple, whereas Strip Mine is outright banned in Legacy for being too good. Strip Mine is also restricted in Vintage, which means it will come up less frequently in games than Wasteland. But not only is it effectively the 5th land destruction land for decks that wish to run it, but it's a stronger version of the effect to boot. It also assists when an opponent has a Pithing Needle effect that stops the activated abilities of specific cards. By running both Wasteland and Strip Mine, your opponent will never be able to fully know which of the two to name, especially if you play a deck with the capability to search up specific lands. Now, Strip Mine isn't higher, partly because it does share so much space with Wasteland in the format, but its sheer strength is enough to warrant it being on this list. Even decks that don't need that much mana tend to rely on at least a few lands to function. As such, Strip Mine has found itself as the most played land in the format just because of how easy it is to slot into decks and how effective it can be against just about any deck. And at number 8, we have Doomsday. This sorcery costs 3 black mana and searches your library and graveyard for 5 cards, then exiles the rest. You put those chosen cards on top of your library in any order, then you lose half your life, rounded up. This card essentially lets you pick any 5 cards and essentially try and win the game with those cards. When the card was first printed, this was a rather tall order, but eventually the game introduced effects that allow you to win the game for having an empty library. The most relevant of these cards is Thassa's Oracle, which can win the game on the spot if your devotion to blue is greater than or equal to the number of cards in your deck. Devotion is determined by the number of colored mana symbols of the color on your battlefield, meaning that Thassa's Oracle on board by itself will win the game if you have 2 or less cards in your library. Alongside Doomsday, this means you need to find a way to draw 3 cards and you can win the game. And since Doomsday lets you stack your deck with the exact cards you want or need, as long as you have something in hand to get things started, just a singular draw effect is usually enough to win you the game. If you're lacking on mana, you can put fast mana sources in those 5 cards. If you hadn't drawn Thassa's Oracle yet, you can put her there. Doomsday is so effective as a combo win condition since it has so many varying lines for various situations. Between search effects and powerful draw spells like Ancestral Recall, it's not hard at all to assemble and even protect the combo. While it's no longer the top combo in the format, Doomsday remains one of Vintage's most prominent combo decks given just how quickly and efficiently the deck can win. Its biggest weakness, of course, comes from just how all-in it is. If Thassa's Oracle is countered and you're left with just a couple or even 0 cards of the deck, you're probably not going to win that game. These weaknesses tend to be outweighed by just how consistent the deck is, and how easily it is to protect the combo in the process. And at number 7, we have Paradoxical Outcome. This instant spell costs 3 generic and 1 blue mana and can return any number of target non-land, non-token permanents you control to their owner's hand. You can also draw a card for each card returned to your hand in this way. This sort of mass bounce effect generally isn't too playable in most formats, since the cost of replaying all those cards you bounce is usually not worth it, and sets you too far behind. Even when used to protect your cards from removal, it's more effective to use a card that gives the whole board protection instead of return them to the hand. However, as previous entries have made clear, Vintage is a format uniquely about really fast, often free mana acceleration. With the Moxen, Paradoxical Outcome can actually refund you mana if you bounce your tapped Moxen, then replay it. Paradoxical Outcome decks run a high density of low mana value artifacts to use alongside the deck's namesake card to draw as many cards as possible and cast as many spells as they can. Paradoxical Storm has been the dominant combo strategy in Vintage for some time, given how well the card synergizes with the format's card pool. No other formats have the density of valuable, mana-producing artifacts that can both play Paradoxical Outcome so early, and also draw so many cards off it without setting itself behind in tempo. A card that was likely designed more for slower games has instead found its most consistent home in blazing fast combo decks that aim to cast the spell multiple times in a single turn if they can manage it. There are various builds of the deck in the format, with some opting to focus on Displacer Kitten to get further value from the Paradoxical Outcome lines. Given that Vintage will always be centralized around these powerful artifacts, it's unlikely Paradoxical Outcome will ever fully fall out of its spot in the limelight of the format. While there had always been artifact-based storm decks in the format, Paradoxical Outcome was instantly the best game plan for that sort of deck. Even if you don't manage to combo off, sometimes even just drawing a handful of interaction off of a single Paradoxical Outcome can be enough to snowball into a winning game. And at number 6, we have Tinker. Tinker is a sorcery that costs 2 generic and 1 blue mana and has an additional cost to sacrifice it an artifact. It allows you to search your library for an artifact card, put that card into the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Essentially, this card allows you to trade one artifact you control for any other artifact in your deck. Since there are no limits on what artifact you sacrifice or what artifact you get, this allows you to play out an artifact far earlier than you normally should. One common target is Bolas's Citadel, a legendary artifact that usually costs 3 generic and 3 black mana, and thus is quite hard to cast. Tinker simply puts it onto the battlefield for you, and from there you can use the effect to cast cards off the top of your library by paying life equal to the card's mana value. Given that most cards in Vintage have fairly low mana values, this card can allow most decks to play several cards in one turn, and perhaps even win the game that turn with it. This is far from the only valuable target for the card, however. Given that Time Vault is legal and limited to 1 copy, this can help find Time Vault, or if you're already drawn Time Vault, it can also be used to find the Manifold Key that combos with Time Vault to give you infinite turns. Part of what makes Tinker so ubiquitous beyond the sheer power of the targets it can grab is how easy it is to pay for its cost. One of the defining features of Vintage as a format is that all the fast mana is legal. Since every deck can run every Mox, as well as other mana artifacts, decks by default run several cards that can be used to both cast Tinker early and sacrifice to pay its costs. Tinker can be played on turn 1 in Vintage and bring out basically any card for any matchup. Some Tinker decks even opt to run Sphinx of the Steel Wind in the main or sideboard as an option to wall certain creature-focused strategies. The card's versatility and ability to cheat out any of the artifacts in the format lead to Tinker itself getting restricted to a single copy in the format. The card is only 6 in this list because its power mostly relies on the other power cards in the format. While cards that search other cards are potent, they tend to boost consistency in decks. What sets it apart from other search effects like Demonic Tutor is that this card goes directly onto the battlefield, which allows Tinker to cheat mana cost and use the card for direct combo potential. And at number 5, we have Bazaar of Baghdad. This card is a land that only has the ability to tap to draw 2 cards and then discard 3. Unlike most other lands in the game, Bazaar of Baghdad does not produce any mana with any of its abilities. While this is often a massive downside that makes most lands like it unplayable, Bazaar's ability is potent enough that decks are built around the card. This wasn't always the case, however, since when the card was first printed, there just weren't any cards that synergize with it properly. The card is at its strongest when you actively want to discard cards, and as such, it took some time for the card to really take off. Dredge was a mechanic introduced in Ravnica, which worked immensely well with Bazaar. Dredge cards wanted to be in the graveyard since you can replace any instance of drawing a card, with instead milling cards equal to a dredge card's dredge cost, and then returning the card from your graveyard to your hand. Bazaar both got the dredge cards into the graveyard and could then be tapped on the next turn to dredge those cards back to hand and build the deck. These decks notably do not run any of the lands beyond Bazaar of Baghdad. This is partly because the best form of interaction, Vintage, doesn't cost any mana at all, and also because there's such a high density of creatures that can return from the graveyard after being milled or ways to deal damage via milling that Vintage dredge decks to this day tend to run very little, if any, actual mana sources. This isn't the only deck in the format leveraging Bazaar, however. Its interaction with the card Hollow One, which costs less depending on how many cards you discard this turn, makes it so a single activation of Bazaar of Baghdad makes casting any copies of Hollow One free. This gives you a sizable creature by itself, but if combined with one of the Root Wallaces that can be cast for free if you discard them, then you suddenly are able to deploy multiple creatures in a single turn. The idea of the deck is to have as many ways to incidentally cast creatures for free so that you can return Vengevine from your graveyard with its ability and swing in for lots of damage as early as the first turn. These decks tend to play fairly all in and often really need to open with Bazaar Baghdad to play to their full potential, which just goes to show just how powerful the card is in the only sanctioned format where it's legal. Bazaar Baghdad is too strong for every other sanctioned format, only able to exist in Vintage because its card pool allows essentially everything in it. And at number 4, we have Gitaxian Probe. This sorcery costs 1 Phyrexian blue mana, which can be paid with either 1 blue mana or 2 life. The card allows you to look at a player's hand and then draw a card. Compared to other 1 mana draw spells in the format, it may seem at surface value weaker than something like Ponder. However, the most important detail about Gitaxian Probe is that its Phyrexian mana cost means that the spell is essentially free. 2 life is hardly a cost, and unless you're nearly dead, you're almost always going to pay 2 life to cast the card. This means Gitaxian Probe is a free way to get perfect information on your opponent's hand without even costing you on card advantage. Before any limitations or bannings were placed on the card, any deck could have run 4 copies of the card and essentially run a 56 card deck with some free information. That free information can be incredibly relevant too, since it will allow you to play around whatever your opponent has, as well as greatly limiting their ability to bluff. This card was so free to run that it would eventually be banned in every sanctioned format besides Vintage. In Vintage, the card was less polarizing, yet still fairly ubiquitous, especially in Monastery Mentor decks that aim to cast as many free non-creature spells as possible in a single turn to generate a large amount of tokens. Eventually, the metagame of Vintage became so centralized around Mentor decks and the decks that beat Mentor decks that they restricted Gitaxian Probe in the format. To this day, it's still one of the most widely played cards in the format, showing up in all sorts of decks. In particular, combo decks and control decks run the card given that they really want to have knowledge of what cards in their opponent's hand as to best know when to use theirs. Some aggro decks also run the card, although those tend to be more spell-focused aggressive decks. Gitaxian Probe is perhaps the most broken cantrip in Magic the Gathering, and Vintage is really the only format where it's still allowed to shine at all. And at number 3, we have Mana Crypt, and by extension, all of the fast mana. This artifact costs 0 mana and can be tapped to make 2 colorless mana. At the beginning of your upkeep, you flip a coin, and if you lose the flip, Mana Crypt does 3 damage to you. This downside is fairly minimal, since while the damage can add up, you always have a 50% chance to not take any damage from it each turn. Compared to other mana rocks that enter tapped and need you to pay mana to untap them, Mana Crypt is able to produce mana early and with minimal downside or cost. Some could argue that this spot should go to Soul Ring or another piece of fast mana, but Mana Crypt is the most played of any of the non-power 9 mana artifacts. This is partly because it's additional mana that does not require you to spend colored mana on it. Soul Ring and Mana Vault both cost mana to cast, meaning you'll often have to use your land to play them. While this is by no means bad, if you open with Mana Crypt, it allows you to cast more mana acceleration without spending your colored mana yet. Or if you're an artifact deck not really focused on colored spells at all, you can simply just cast more powerful, low mana value artifacts. Mana Crypt and the other sources of fast mana are what make Vintage unique. It's the only format of Magic where you're expected to have so many mana producing permanents on the first turn. This wholly unique environment where 3 or 4 drops come down on turn 1 and turn 2 exists because of cards like Mana Crypt. While this has mostly focused on Mana Crypt so far, this entry could really count for any of the premier mana rocks in the format. Soul Ring only costs 1 generic mana and taps for 2 colorless mana and has no downsides at all. And while Mana Vault may cost mana to untap itself, it taps for 3 colorless and costs just 1 generic mana and can be untapped by other means to generate absurd amounts of mana. These artifacts form the backbone of the format alongside the Moxen and other fast generic options that have all been limited for years. While they may not be as exciting as other picks, these exciting options would never have a place in the format at all without its powerful suit of mana acceleration. And at number 2, we have Mishra's Workshop. This land's ability taps for 3 colorless mana, but can only be used to cast artifact spells. While this is certainly a notable limitation in theory, in practice there are more than enough playable artifacts to make a deck entirely out of artifacts. As such, in practice, this is a land that just taps for 3 mana with no downsides as long as your deck is full of artifacts. Generally speaking, lands that tap for 2 or more mana have some activation cost, or enter tapped. A land that taps for 3 with no additional requirements or downsides can put a deck so far ahead if it's their first land drop that the card isn't legal in any other sanctioned format. These workshop decks aim to cast restrictive spells like Lodestone Golem as fast as possible. Lodestone makes non-artifact spells cost 1 more generic mana and also has decent attacking stats with 5 power, meaning that landing this card on turn 2 is extremely threatening in the format. This card was so backbreaking alongside Workshop that Lodestone Golem was restricted to 1 copy in the format. This is the only format Lodestone Golem is naturally legal in that has any banlist limitations on it, specifically thanks to Workshop's effect on the format. This aggressive deck looks to strangle your opponent's resources and ability to play cards, to a point where it even runs Karn, the Great Curator, to both turn off your opponent's artifacts, but also lock your opponent out of the game entirely thanks to its combo with the searchable Mike and Santh Lattice. Artifacts like Nettlecyst and the aforementioned high stats of Lodestone Golem make it hard for an opponent to properly catch up before the Workshop deck beats them. This combination of aggro and lockdown style control makes for one of the defining decks of the vintage format. Mishra's Workshop is one of the backbone cards of the format to a point where several of the deck's best cards have been restricted as to not have to instead restrict the Workshop itself. This card is iconic to the format, and many consider it one of its signature cards. However, while Workshop may be one of the iconic and certainly powerful cards, another card is arguably far more polarizing. And finally, at number 1, we have the most impactful card in Vintage, which is Mental Misstep. This instant costs 1 for X and blue mana and counters target spell with a mana value of 1. While narrow counterspells tend to not be very playable, Mental Misstep in particular has several key things that make it particularly potent. For one, as mentioned with Gitaxian Probe, a spell that costs a single Phyrexian mana is essentially a free spell that any deck can run. Free counterspells are the backbone of Legacy and Vintage, but those free counterspell decks specifically require blue cards to use them. In comparison, Mental Misstep can be used by anyone against anyone. And given that in competitive formats, decks prefer to play the most efficient spells they can, that means most formats rely heavily on spells with the mana value of 1. Most decks that run Mental Misstep don't do so because they wanted to counter other spells specifically, but more because they want to counter their opponent's Mental Missteps. If your deck had an important spell that costs a single mana, you would need to run Mental Misstep to not get completely torn apart by an opponent who does run the card. While Mental Misstep was banned quickly in most formats, it remained fully legal in Vintage for years. Many felt like Mental Misstep was an auto-included deck that you were required to run in most cases, and thus limited slots to the deck in general. Decks that use limited sources of mana, or even no mana at all, like the aforementioned Dredge deck, were essentially fond of the card to protect their graveyard and disrupt opponents. Mental Misstep in general is most effective against interactive decks, since many of the best interaction spells in the format, as well as the spells they use to set up, cost 1 mana. Eventually, Mental Misstep was restricted to 1 copy of the format, and to this day, it remains one of the most played cards in the format. It's the 4th most played card in the format, seeing more play than 6 members of the Power 9, and the format's other ubiquitous counterspell, Force of Will. Force of Will and Force of Negation are undeniably powerful, yet both require you to exile another blue card from your hand, meaning that they are far less splashable. The fact that these counterspells cost you an extra card is usually worth it, but the fact that Mental Misstep can sometimes be just as backbreaking but have none of these extra hoops goes to show why it's the only counterspell on this list. Mental Misstep is one of the most controversial cards in all of Magic, a design mistake that warped the game around itself, and is one of the most powerful cards ever printed, let alone in Vintage. Alright, and that's the list. Are there the cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos similar to this one? If so, go ahead and leave it down in the comment below.